There are few compositions more famous than Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Entire books and countless essays and articles have been written about the composition, and it has been performed the world over. Its monumental choral finale, citing the words of influential German poet Friedrich Schiller, has inspired composers and laypeople alike from the 19th century to the present day. This video focuses on just a few of the issues covered by your reading. In addition to the commentary of Lewis Lockwood, I encourage you to check out David Levy's book entitled Beethoven the Ninth Symphony. Regarding the fourth movement in particular, I'd recommend an article by James Webster entitled The Form of the Finale of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony that was published in the journal Beethoven Forum in 1992. At around 70 minutes in length, the ninth is Beethoven's longest symphony. Its first three movements roughly correspond with typical symphonic movements of the time, being in sonata, scherzo, and variation forms. As we will see, the innovative creativity of the fourth movement, which grandly concludes in the major mode, much like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony had, goes far beyond any symphonic movement composed before it. The Ninth Symphony saw its premiere in Vienna on May 7th of 1824. This was alongside three movements from the Missa Solemnis and an overture, most likely the Consecration of the House overture. Later that same month, the symphony was again played, this time in the Redouten Saal of the Habsburg Palace in Vienna. By 1846, the Ninth Symphony had been performed over 80 times, from London to New York City and from Paris, France to Leipzig, Germany. In the late 1840s, Richard Wagner conducted the work 3 times at Dresden, writing passionately about the composition in newspaper and journal marketing leading up to his performance. The first movement of the Ninth Symphony begins with the now iconic pianissimo A-E perfect fifth dyad. Its ambiguity, tonally speaking, allows the first theme of the first movement to gradually take form from the triadic dotted figures first heard in the violins in measures 2 and 3. The first and principal theme of the movement finally emerges at measure 17 and following, running through measure 35. At this point the dynamics subside, and the orchestral texture again slips to the open fifth tremolos and melodic motives of the first measures of the movement. And you can see that in the last 3 measures of this excerpt. The exposition moves from D minor to B flat major, down a third rather than up a third to the relative major, a tonal pattern already traced in the Hammerklavier Sonata. After development and recapitulation, the movement ends with a bombastic restatement of the principal theme. This is performed in octaves by the strings and woodwinds and harmonically undergirded by the horns, trumpets, and the timpani. The Moto Perpetuo second movement, Scherzo, opens with fortissimo dotted octave figures in the strings. This is answered by the timpani in measure 5 and by the trumpets and the rest of the winds in measure 6. The scherzo theme enters very softly in the first violins at measure 9. It will be canonically and obsessively imitated throughout the orchestra for the rest of the scherzo. The scherzo's trio slips into duple time and features a lyrical melody that might be heard as a foretaste of the joy theme of the choral finale. The trio theme is first presented by the woodwinds. The strings begin the imitative response that eventually spreads to the entire orchestra. The third movement of the Ninth Symphony ranks among the most beautiful of all symphonic movements. It is a double variations movement, much like the slow movement of the Fifth Symphony, in that Beethoven varies 2 themes, not just 1 theme, in alternation with each other. The first theme appears in measure 3 in the tonic of B flat major. The second theme appears in the strings at measure 25, is an andante moderato, and is in D major. As James Webster masterfully shows, music analysts have taken myriad approaches to the final movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Among them are descriptions of the movement's form as a sonata, as a mini symphony, a mini concerto, an operatic finale, a mini oratorio, and as a set of variations. Discussing the relative strengths and weaknesses of these and other approaches unfortunately goes far beyond the scope of this very short presentation. Here we'll discuss some key points taken from the movement's 5 main sections as delineated by Beethoven's chief tempo and expressive marks. The orchestral introduction opens with what Richard Wagner called the Schreckenfanfare, a forte and dissonant call to attention that may remind one of the less dissonant fanfares of the final movement of the Eroica Symphony. In measure 8, the cellos and double basses enter with a melody that can only be understood as instrumental recitative. The Schreckenfanfare returns, and after another short instrumental recitative, Beethoven reprises 8 bars of the opening of the symphony at measure 30. The basses reject this with a chromatic recitative, and 8 bars from the second movement of the symphony follow at measure 48. They receive an only slightly less dissonant reply in the cellos, triggering a 2-bar reprise of the third movement. Again the basses respond with a chromatic line, here starting legato and piano and climaxing to a staccato and fortissimo close. Finally, Beethoven tries out the first 4 bars of what will become the Ode to Joy theme at measure 77. The basses respond with a much more diatonic recitative. The orchestra responds with 4 statements of the Ode to Joy theme, starting with a solo version in the basses and cellos and growing to a full orchestral presentation by the end of the section. Shockingly, the Schreckenfanfare returns, and this time the recitative is sung by a baritone soloist. He sings with words penned by Beethoven. "O friends, not with these tones, rather let us sing more pleasing and joyful ones." We now know what the cellos and double basses have been telling us with their recitatives. Here the men's chorus responds, singing the word Freude, joy. At measure 238, the bass soloist takes off with the first 4 lines of Schiller's Ode to Joy. The choir responds with lines 5 through 8 of that opening poetic chorus. The 4 soloists sing 4 more lines of the ode, and the choir again responds with the second half of that strophe. The bass and tenor soloists sing an ornamented 8th note version of lines from another strophe of Schiller's poem. They are joined by the alto and soprano soloist for the rest of the strophe. The chorus echoes the solo parts with full orchestral accompaniment, and the first main section of the movement ends. The choir has been singing of angels standing before God with full orchestral accompaniment. The sublimity of this moment is immediately juxtaposed with a, although not ridiculous, still strongly contrasting Turkish march. This march sets the first half of Schiller's 4th strophe as seen on your screen. These words refer to the triumph of the sun. Set to Turkish Janissary music, this may refer to the triumph of Western European powers over the Eastern lunar crescent of the Ottoman Empire. Turkish music, with its percussion and double reeds, was the rage in early 19th century Vienna, but not without its baggage. The Ottoman Turks had repeatedly laid siege to Vienna and the entire Habsburg Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Turkish march thus represented both an exotic and a dangerous other to many of Beethoven's listeners. The Turkish section of the Ninth Symphony finale is in a rollicking 6/8 meter. This leads to an orchestral fugue at measure 433. It culminates in a reprise of the chorus of Schiller's poem. The next section of the movement provides still more contrast. Beethoven sets 4 new lines from Schiller's poem in a heightened declamatory style in unison long notes values. This is a style that was evocative of sacred chant for its early 19th century listeners. Switching to a devotional, if not too slow adagio, Beethoven sets 4 more lines. The sopranos sustain a pianissimo G against hushed A major tremolos in the orchestra as they sing of the starry canopy above. The final section of the Ninth Symphony draws on the grandest symphonic and operatic styles of its day. At measure 655, Beethoven combines the words and the music of the Ode to Joy chorus with the descending chant-like melodic line that presented the words of the preceding section. Quote, "Be embraced, millions, this kiss for the entire world." Beethoven's well-written counterpoint culminates in yet another high note for the sopranos, here a sustained A on the word world. The sopranos sustain the A over full orchestral accompaniment for a total of 12 bars. The final 175-some measures of the piece present important phrases from Schiller's text in a number not unlike an operatic finale. The soloists sing in alternation with the chorus. There are poco adagio moments that give the listener a chance to briefly contemplate the words set. Most strikingly, there is a cut-time stretta at measure 843 that Beethoven marks faster with accelerating tempo, always faster. Cut-time strettas, not to be confused with the fugal technique of stretto, end many operatic finales of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. After the final choral articulation of the Götterfunken, that is, of the sparks of God, the orchestra provides a suitably triumphant close. This is Beethoven at his most grandiose. The choral finale showcases the contrasting extremes of Beethoven's late style in their most pronounced forms.